What is the significance of the Canadian Constitution, including the Constitution Act of 1867 and the Constitution Act 1982, in governing the country? The Canadian Constitution forms the foundation of the country's legal and political system, defining the structure of government and the rights of its citizens. Its development reflects Canada's journey from a group of British colonies to a fully sovereign nation. Two pivotal pieces of legislation in this journey are the Constitution Act, 1867, and the Constitution Act, 1982, the latter of which includes the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. However, the story of Canada's constitutional evolution is far broader, involving multiple acts, agreements, and conventions that have shaped the modern nation we know today. The Constitution Act, 1867, and the formation of the Dominion. Canada's path to nationhood began with the British North America Act, 1867, now known as the Constitution Act, 1867. This legislation united the colonies of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia into the Dominion of Canada, establishing the country's federal structure. The Act outlined the division of powers between the federal government and the provinces, a core feature of Canadian governance that remains to this day. It provided the federal government with jurisdiction over areas like defense, trade, and taxation, while the provinces were given control over local matters, such as education and healthcare. Despite the creation of Canada as a dominion, the Constitution Act, 1867, did not grant full independence. Canada was still part of the British Empire, and ultimate authority resided with the British Crown and Parliament. Britain retained control over Canada's foreign affairs, and crucially, any amendments to the Constitution had to be made by the British Parliament. Canada's legal and political status within the Empire was that of a self-governing colony, but one that lacked full sovereignty, especially in its ability to manage its external affairs and amend its own constitution. The Balfour Declaration of 1926 and the Statute of Westminster 1931. The turning point in Canada's path toward greater autonomy came with the Balfour Declaration of 1926. During an imperial conference that year, Britain and its dominions, including Taith, being Canada, reached a consensus that the dominions were shots, autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal in status, in no way subordinate to one another in any aspect of their domestic or external affairs. The Balfour Declaration recognized that Canada and other dominions should have full control over their own internal and external policies, establishing the principle that Canada was an equal partner in the British Commonwealth rather than a colony. This recognition was formalized in law through the Statute of Westminster in 1931, which granted Canada and other dominions full legal autonomy. The statute allowed Canada to make its own laws, conduct its foreign affairs, and manage its defense without requiring approval from Britain. However, a key provision of the Statute of Westminster allowed the British Parliament to continue legislating on behalf of the Dominions at their request. Canada specifically requested that Britain retain authority over constitutional amendments because there was no consensus within Canada on how such amendments should be made domestically. The federal government and the provinces could not agree on an amending formula, and as a result, any changes to the Canadian Constitution still required British approval. This arrangement lasted until 1982. The Constitution Act, 1982, and full sovereignty. By the late 20th century, Canadian leaders sought to take full control over the country's constitution, including the ability to amend it without British involvement. This desire culminated in the patriation of the Constitution in 1982 under the leadership of Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. The Constitution Act, 1982, was a landmark moment in Canadian history, as it finally brought the Constitution under full Canadian control, ending the need for British approval on constitutional amendments. It also included the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which fundamentally reshaped Canada's legal landscape by enshrining individual rights and freedoms in the Constitution. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees fundamental rights such as freedom of expression, equality before the law, and mobility rights. It also provides legal protections against discrimination based on race, gender, and other characteristics. Since its inclusion in the Constitution Act, 1982, the Charter has played a central role in shaping Canadian society, empowering individuals to challenge government actions that infringe upon their rights. Landmark legal cases have emerged from Charter challenges, leading to significant advances in areas like LGBTQ+ rights, gender equality, and Indigenous rights. However, it is important to note that the Constitution Act, 1982, did not just introduce the Charter. It also addressed the long-standing issue of constitutional amendments by introducing a domestic amending formula, finally ending the need for British involvement. There are 4 amending formulas designed to balance federal and provincial interests. The 750 formula. This is used for most constitutional changes affecting the entire country. It requires the approval of the federal parliament and 2/3 of the provinces representing at least 50% of the population, making constitutional amendments challenging but fully within Canada's control. The Unanimity Clause. For fundamental changes, such as those affecting the office of the monarch, the governor-general, provincial viceroys, the powers of the Senate, or the method in which senators are selected, the Supreme Court's composition or functions, or the use of English and French at the federal level, unanimous consent from all provinces and the federal government is required. Following the failures of the Meech Lake and Charlottetown Accords, it is now believed that a non-binding referendum would also be needed before attempting such amendments. Single province amendments. If a constitutional change only affects one province, it requires the consent of the federal parliament and the affected province's legislature. Federal-only amendments. Changes that affect only federal institutions or powers, such as altering federal election laws, require only the approval of Parliament. The introduction of these formulas in the Constitution Act, 1982, ended the long-standing reliance on British Parliament for constitutional amendments, placing this power firmly in Canadian hands. The strengthening of the Supreme Court of Canada. One of the significant ramifications of the Constitution Act, 1982, and particularly the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, was the strengthening of the Supreme Court of Canada. The Supreme Court became the ultimate interpreter of the Charter, gaining the power to strike down laws and government actions that violated constitutional rights. This marked a significant shift in the balance of power within Canada's legal system. Prior to 1982, Parliament was the supreme authority in terms of lawmaking, with limited judicial oversight. After 1982, the judiciary, and specifically the Supreme Court, assumed a more prominent role in safeguarding constitutional rights. The Supreme Court's enhanced role has had far-reaching implications for Canadian governance and society. It has become the guardian of the Charter, ensuring that governments at all levels respect the fundamental rights enshrined within it. This judicial empowerment has sometimes placed the court at odds with governments, particularly when controversial issues arise. For instance, in cases related to same-sex marriage, abortion rights, and Indigenous land claims, the Supreme Court has used the Charter to protect individual and collective rights, often leading to policy changes. The Constitution Act, 1982, effectively transformed the Supreme Court into the final arbiter of constitutional law in Canada, making it a critical institution in the country's democratic system. This shift towards judicial supremacy has had both positive and contentious consequences, as it ensures the protection of rights but also occasionally limits the legislative power of elected officials. Other constitutional acts and amendments. In addition to the Constitution Act, 1867, and the Constitution Act, 1982, several other constitutional acts and amendments have played important roles in Canada's development. Some of these include the Constitution Act, 1871. This act gave the federal government the authority to create new provinces and territories. It also clarified the relationship between the provinces and the federal government, particularly with respect to territorial expansion and governance. The Constitution Act, 1907. This act dealt with the financial relationship between the federal government and the provinces, adjusting how funds were distributed to provincial governments to ensure financial stability. The Constitution Act, 1930. This act transferred control over natural resources from the federal government to the provinces, giving provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba greater authority over their own economic development. This was a key development in Canada's federal structure. The Meech Lake and Charlottetown Accords. These were attempts in the 1980s and 1990s to amend the Constitution to address Quebec's desire for recognition as a distinct society and to reform the Senate. Both accords ultimately failed, reflecting the difficulty of achieving broad consensus for constitutional changes in Canada's diverse federation. The Constitution. Today, Canada's Constitution continues to be a living document that shapes how the country is governed. The Constitution Act, 1867, remains the foundation of Canada's federal system. outlining the division of powers between the federal government and the provinces. The Constitution Act, 1982, with its Charter of Rights and Freedoms, has added a layer of protection for individual rights, ensuring that governments remain accountable to the law and the people. The combination of parliamentary sovereignty and judicial oversight has created a balanced system where elected officials are empowered to govern, but within the framework of constitutional rights. The Supreme Court plays an essential role in interpreting the Constitution, ensuring that laws conform to the principles laid out in the Charter. Conclusion: the Canadian Constitution, including the Constitution Act, 1867, and the Constitution Act, 1982, is a vital framework for the country's governance. It reflects Canada's long journey from a British colony to a fully independent nation, while also safeguarding the rights of its citizens. Through its division of powers, the Constitution has provided stability and unity in a vast and diverse country, while the Charter of Rights and Freedoms ensures that individual liberties remain protected in an evolving society. As Canada continues to face new challenges, its Constitution remains the foundation of its democracy and its commitment to justice and equality.